Okay, we are on to part two, excuse me, of period three. This part of period three is called the American Revolution and Confederation, 1774 to 1787. So where did we leave off last time? With the Intolerable Acts, as we had built from 1750, with the end of the final war for empire, the French and Indian War, which concluded with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The French are out of North America, but Britain is beset with an indescribable war debt. Now we're going to have an end of salutary neglect, and Britain is going to regulate the colonies to pay for the war and the cost of maintaining an empire. And their actions now to increase their control of the colonies is viewed by some as a threat to their liberty, feeling they are denied the right to participate in the political process, political positive liberty, and also that their individual rights, right, their rights as freeborn Englishmen, are now being violated by a government, again, which is not of their own making. However, short of 1774, even in the most radical areas such as Massachusetts, we don't see that call for independence. The Intolerable Acts changes that. That was in response to the Boston Tea Party. Remember, it's the closure of Boston Harbor, the closure of the Massachusetts government, right? The declaration that Massachusetts is in rebellion, the Quebec Act. So now the colonists, called the First Continental Congress. Every colony, except I believe it was Georgia, sent a representative, and you had different factions there. You had the Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, John Adams radical faction, which is not calling for independence, but rather is saying, look, Parliament, this idea of virtual representation is not legitimate. And we need significant reform in the relationship between Britain and its colonies in order for us to have our liberties protected. Then you had more moderates like conservatives like John Dickinson and John Jay that wanted to protest, but at the same time not suggest anything that was so radical that Britain might have a harsher response. So what do we have that goes down at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774? Well, we have Joseph Galloway that presents a whole new organization of the relationship between Britain and the colonies. He proposes a plan of union, much like the Albany Plan of Union, where you would have a single colonial government, and that single colonial government would act as a liaison to dealing with the British imperial rule. And Galloway's plan fails by one vote. So the colonies will not have an official political organization in which to have a single body dealing with the imperial government. The Suffolk Resolves right here. This comes from the more radical faction led by Massachusetts, and they demand that the Intolerable Acts be repealed immediately, that military preparations be made if these Intolerable Acts, again, that's what Britain referred to as the Coercive Acts, are not lifted, and that we have a boycott of British goods until those Intolerable Acts are repealed. You also have passed out of that First Continental Congress this Declaration of Rights and Grievances, in which the Continental Congress asked the king to intervene and redress their grievances, particularly the violations of liberty that culminated with the Intolerable Acts. But they also accepted that Parliament can regulate commerce, okay? And then finally, the First Continental Congress said, if this stuff isn't resolved, we are going to meet again in May of 1775. But you all know what happens in April of 1775, don't you? Yes, you do, right? The shot heard round the world. Here we are. Lexington and Concord. So the king does not meet the colonists halfway. And there is more of an army under General Gage that is sent to Boston to enforce imperial order. The British find out that at Concord there are colonial weapons. So as a much larger British army lands in Boston, prepared to embark, you have Paul Revere and William Dawes sound the warning. Minutemen from Lexington meet at Concord and exchange fire with the British Army. You all learn the story in elementary school, how the colonial militia retreats. But on their march back to Boston from Concord, after having destroyed some of the weapons there, about 250 British soldiers are picked off, and it's rather humiliating. Following that is this Battle of Bunker Hill. It's really a battle that occurs in Breeds Hill in Boston, where the British Army marches up and does retake Breeds Hill, again known as Bunker Hill, but they take 1,000 casualties. So the colonists are, the Patriots are defeated. The British win the battle, but it gives some legs to the cause in that the British were mowed down. The colonists just ran out of ammunition, and it showed that maybe this is something that could be won. So now, when we meet the Second Continental Congress, again, we're still not talking about independence. Only the most radicals, right, particularly from New England, are suggesting independence. The Second Continental Congress does something that's a little bit of a paradox. So they issue the Olive Branch Petition, which you see right here, which again goes to the king. They pledge their loyalty, and they ask the king to intercede and restore their liberties. The king dismisses this and passes the Prohibitory Act, which declares colonies are in open rebellion. We are going to defeat them militarily. In addition to passing this Olive Branch Petition, which the king rejected, again, it said we are still loyal subjects. King, please intercede and restore our traditional liberties as freeborn Englishmen. They also passed the Declaration for the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, in which they create a colonial army. And of course, George Washington, though he was very undistinguished during the French and Indian War, was appointed to lead this Continental Army that was created. Washington was also a Southerner from Virginia, so it was to show more of a continental appeal to this movement rather than just a bunch of Boston hotheads. Excuse me. Okay. They also say we're going to have a navy to harass British shipping, and we'll try to invade Canada to take some heat off of this. All right. So as the war goes on into the winter of 1775, we see the most important piece of American propaganda ever, Common Sense. Basically, in which two things that Common Sense does, as again, rebelling from England in the winter of 75, 76 is still a very radical idea. Mostly in New England, some in Virginia, again, like Patrick Henry. This was before he smelled a rat. So Paine makes two arguments. One, it really denounces the monarchy as a degenerative institution, right? Basically saying that England is not a republic. It is much more of an absolute monarchy. One man, the king, holds so much power with his ability to appoint ministers, with his ability to influence how the laws are made, and he's a monarch, right? And King George is not a particularly good monarch at that. Why should Americans be ruled by such a poor, corrupt form of government? The other part of Common Sense is, how can a small island rule a vast continent? Not only that, how can a small island rule a vast continent that is so far away? It does not make sense. So as that influences a lot of Americans, we have now by July, after the war is over a year old, the Second Continental Congress adopting the Declaration of Independence, written by mainly Thomas Jefferson, in which it is an indictment against the king, right? And it is a justification for why the colonists are justified in leaving this government, when in the course of human events, guys, right? Where the government is not living up to the social contract, where it has lost the consent of the government, and it reeks of these ideas of the Enlightenment, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, alluding to the natural rights of John Locke. So as this goes with the colonies have declared independence, and we talk about the American Revolution, it's a disaster. Very few wins. Remember, George Washington wins 3 battles, loses 6, but he never surrenders, right? Even in the winter of 77, when the army is trapped, 77 to 78 at Valley Forge, right? New York has been lost. Washington retreats. Philadelphia has been lost. It is a disaster. Washington's great genius is in not being defeated and in keeping an army that basically wasn't paid. And we all know the privations of Valley Forge was not ever well supplied. The only bright spot in 75, 76, 77, 78 came here at Saratoga, right? Where in upstate New York in 77, you have a very ambitious invasion by British General, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, who marches in great splendor through the wilderness of New York from Canada. And the idea was, we'll take control of the Hudson Valley, and we are going to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, and it will be easy to defeat them afterwards. I could talk forever about the Battle of Saratoga. Suffice to say, the colonials win, and they violate all the gentlemanly rules of war. They have snipers shoot generals. But we win, okay? And the New England is not cut off, but more importantly, right, who will now officially recognize the United States thanks to Ben Franklin? That's right, les Français. So since 1775, all types of shady stuff was going on between the French government secretly funneling money, funneling supplies to America. But now Louis XVI, who is no fan, right? Remember, this is absolutism in France, is no fan of republicanism, is no fan of the liberty, the rhetoric, the radicalism of the revolution, but he sees a chance to stick it to Great Britain. So now there is an open alliance. We signed that perpetual military alliance with France in 1778. That's going to come back to haunt us again, right? And with the British now face a much wider war, as France is going to attack Great Britain everywhere. And they reached the decision of, all right, we got to win, and we got to win now. Now, remember, during the American Revolution, these are approximations. About 40% of those living in the colonies, they estimate, were patriots, okay? They favored independence. Roughly 30% were loyalists, right? You had 60,000 loyalists fighting alongside the British Army. Then you had about another 30% that just wanted to stay out, just stay neutral, and not get caught up in the war. So after you have French recognition after 1778, the failure to cut off New England with Saratoga in 1777, the war is now going to shift to the South, right? And that's the last phase of the war. And because of so much British help, and again, the South is horrible, right? It has the most loyalist Tories fighting. It is partisan fighting. It is savage. It is like the frontier fighting on with the Indians during the French and Indian War. No quarter. It is terrible, right? But it is a conventional battle, right? Where are we here? Yorktown, right? On Virginia, where Washington is able to trap, Cornwallis's army, with the help of the French, particularly with their navy. And after this resounding defeat in 1781, it convinces the British government that we can't win. We can win, but to win, it's going to take so much. So like they're broke. Okay. Britain now has not only been fighting a long war in the colonies since 1775, the war with France has broadened it. So they're fighting all over the world, right? They basically get it handed to them. Like their big plan to win in the South, where they have the most loyalists, they get routed. And Cornwallis is a big deal. This is like Mr. Jackson surrendering, right? I mean, like their guy goes down. And so now all of a sudden, the Tory government is out of power. The Whig government is back in power, and they go to Roberto Duran. They say no mas, right? And they capitulate because the cost is so high, and sign the Treaty of Paris, in which, like, think about what the Americans got. They got all of British, not counting Canada, right? But British North America, all the way to what boundary? That's right, the Mississippi River, right? And they got fishing rights off of Canada, and all that we had to agree to was to pay war debts owed to British merchants, and debts from before the war to British merchants, and to restored land to loyalists, which was confiscated during the war and sold to fund the American war effort. Of course, we reneged on that, and that is why Britain does not leave the Northwest, and it contributes all the way up until the War of 1812. 80,000 loyalists left after the war because they either had everything taken from them and wasn't given back, or they feared really harsh reprisals by patriots who had won the war. Okay, so now that brings us to, we won, but we got a major problem. And this is where I started teaching all of y'all back in August, September, right? Where we have a very ineffective national government. Now, let's not just hate on the Articles of Confederation. After all, right, it won the war. End of story, okay? Say what you want, the French came in and helped out, but it did lead a successful effort to be independent. We'll also come back up to this. It settled the West effectively. But the idea was that even during the war, right, the states retained their sovereignty. The Articles of Confederation was basically enabled the federal government to fight the war, to raise an army, to make treaties, to print money, which became an unmitigated disaster because the continental dollars were worthless. They weren't backed by anything, just promises to pay off with future bonds. They did not have the power to regulate commerce. They had zero coercive power over the states. And of course, they could not tax. They could only requisition funds from the states, with states typically paying, whatever our book said, was at 1/6 of what was requisitioned. It was a unicameral legislation to pass any law that meant anything. 9 out of 13 states, each state had one vote, had to agree. And of course, you all learned in elementary school to amend the articles, you needed a unanimous 13 state vote. Okay. One thing that they did do, though, was figure out a way to divide up the land and settle the West with the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which banned slavery in the old Northwest Territory, but set all of the parameters that, listen, you will have limited representative government when you form a territory. And then once you get enough people, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, it's X amount of people, you write a constitution and you can become a state. And that was a big part to even ratify the Articles of Confederation. The big states like New York and West Virginia had to give up all of their claims to the land in the West, as that was under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So that was successful. However, right, nothing else they did was successful. Remember, we talked about in class, what two problems does the new government face, right? Indescribable debt, right? The country has a massive public debt. The states have massive public debts. Individuals are in debt. The national currency had become worthless. and there is no power to tax. And commerce has a very difficult time getting restored as England is not trading with us, and it's very difficult now for the states to trade with each other as they are sovereign entities which can charge tariffs, right? The idea of debt we saw with Shays Rebellion, where I don't want to go too far off the res here, but remember Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts. Debtors who were unable to pay taxes because they had lost so much during the war and were so in debt during the war years, they openly rebelled and challenged state authority. In Shays Rebellion, it was actually seizing courthouses and prohibiting the imprisonment for debt, the enforcement of debts. But then in other states, like Rhode Island, you had debtors, Shayites, if you will, elected and became the majority, canceling debt, passing stay laws, inflating the money supply, right, which always helps debtors and hurts creditors with worthless currency. And in effect, you saw the property rights of creditors being trampled upon, and this is going to lead to the calling of the Constitutional Convention. Finally, as we said, Spain is going to shut down our access to the Mississippi River, which negates everything in the West. And Britain is refusing to abandon its old North, the military establishments in the Northwest, and is encouraging Indian attacks as well. Very good. Let's see. I got all of that. As here we talk about women. All right. So there are different perspectives on the American Revolution as to, was it evolutionary? How radical was it? And it's not it's radical in terms of forget everything about evolution like that. No more king, no more titles of nobility. All of these sovereign states begin their constitution with an official Declaration of Rights, right? Bills of Rights. In all states, white men with property can vote. You saw property requirements for owning office, but again, for running for office, relative to the rest of the world, there is no republic like this. It's all on the state level, right? And that is rather revolutionary. And again, it eventually what will come out of it is the creation of a federal system, which is very revolutionary. But when you look at slavery not being abolished, as we've talked about before, and we'll deal with slavery later, northern states did, right? Starting with Pennsylvania, in the wake of the American Revolution. And the colonial army even had to match the British army in promising freedom to any slaves that fought for their cause. But as we have learned, slavery was so important to the Southern economy that it's just a total contradiction, affront to all of the liberty revolution, the liberty rhetoric of the American Revolution, that slavery is going to continue to exist. And it's actually going to grow in the South. We'll talk about that. And then with women participate in the American Revolution, right? Like people like Deborah Sampson and Molly Pitcher get all of the headlines. It was very few women that actually fought, but they played an important role in the infrastructure of the camp. But most importantly, it was keeping things going at home during the most difficult of times while men were away. Not much changes, right? Even influential women like Abigail Adams, who invite her husband to remember the ladies. At the Second Continental Congress, we see no expansion of liberties for American women. You know, our textbook says New Jersey gave women the right to vote, but it quickly was rescinded. So a very radical revolution in terms of establishing a republic, the enumeration of rights, the amount of participation that's allowed in government, the eventual creation of a federal system. But at the same time, it is still white men's government. Propertyless men are left out. You have slavery continue in the South, unchallenged. We'll talk about, we'll review how that's written in the Constitution. And women really gain nothing despite their critical role in American society during the American Revolution. In regards to American Indians, Most wanted Britain to originally they tried to stay out. Most wanted Britain to win because Britain promised that they would limit colonial expansion west of the Appalachian Mountains. The British tried to win in the West. People like George Rogers Clark, using Indian allies in the West, but people like George Rogers Clark, I realize I spelled George wrong now, and of course Daniel Boone out of Kentucky, prevent that from happening, and that's why the final showdown takes place in the South. Okay, I think that is it. I think we got everything for the second part. Whew, need a break after that one. All right. Come on, stop recording. All right. See you for the final third, guys.